The air in Charleston's White Point Barden smelled of salt, ancient oaks, and a peace that Alistair Vane had not known in 3 long years. He stood at the edge of the promenade, a billionaire in a bespoke navy suit that felt like a suit of armor designed to protect a hollow chest. He was in South Carolina to finalize a merger that would make Vane Global the largest logistics firm on the East Coast. But as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, the victory felt like ash in his mouth. Success, Alistair had learned, was a vertical coffin if you were living in it alone. Then, the world stopped breathing. Across the park, near a cluster of azaleas, he saw a woman. She was dressed in an emerald silk wrap dress that caught the golden hour light, her hair flowing down her back like a dark river. She was laughing, a resonant, genuine sound that cut through the humidity and struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. Elena. His heart, usually a cold machine of logic and calculations, stuttered. It was a rhythm he hadn't felt since a rainy Tuesday in Manhattan 48 months ago. The transition from the Charleston sun to the New York rain was violent and instantaneous, seeping into his mind like blood through a white bandage. He was back in the Sterling penthouse, 2:47 a.m. Alistair had been waiting in the dark of his study, the blue light of a laptop screen the only thing illuminating the rage on his face. He was a man possessed by a narrative. Vivian Ashford, his head of operations, and the woman his father wanted him to marry, had handed him a digital folder an hour earlier. Inside were grainy, long-lens photos of Elena leaning into a man in a dark alley. The timestamps put her there while Alistair was closing a deal in London. "You are a cheater, Elena. Don't you dare look at me with those lying, innocent eyes." He had screamed it so loud the crystal decanters on the side table had vibrated. Elena had stood in the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of a beige cardigan. She had been holding a small silver box, a gift he never gave her a chance to open. "Alistair, that is my brother, Marcus," she had whispered, her voice a thin thread of terror. "He was in trouble. He needed money to leave the city. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd judge his past. Please, look at the context." "The data doesn't lie," Alistair had whispered, his voice more lethal than a shout. "Vivian found the hotel logs. She found the messages. I gave you my name. I gave you a seat at the most powerful tables in the world, and you chose to desecrate it with a nobody." He had stepped into the light, his face a mask of primal billionaire pride. Elena had tried to speak, to tell him about the test she had taken that morning, but Alistair was already reaching for his checkbook. "I want a child, Elena," he had snarled, his pen scratching against the paper with a sound like a bone snapping. He ripped the check from the book and slid it across the marble island. 6 zeros, a fortune for a social worker. "Get rid of it. Whatever complication you were going to use to tether me to you after this divorce, erase it. The money covers the procedure and your relocation. I want you out of this city by morning." Elena had looked at the check, then at the man she had loved since they were teenagers. She saw the disgust in his eyes, the eyes of a king who had forgotten he was once a man. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She picked up the check, walked to the fireplace, and dropped it into the dying embers. "When you realize the truth, Alistair, and you will realize it, don't you dare come looking for us," she had said, her voice a lethal Arctic melody. She walked out into the rain, and Alistair had let her. He had convinced himself that great men travel light. Now, in the Charleston Park, the Shadow King stood frozen as he watched the woman he had discarded lean down to pick up a small child, then another, and then a third. 3 identical miracles, 2 boys and a girl, their curls dark and wild, their skin the perfect olive gold. And as they turned to follow their mother toward the parking lot, the setting sun hit their faces. Sapphire blue eyes. Eyes that were a perfect, undeniable mirror of Alistair Vane's own. The billionaire's knees finally buckled. He grabbed a nearby wrought iron fence to stay upright, the breath leaving his lungs in a jagged sob.
He had sent her a check to erase a mistake. He had called her a cheater and a liar. And while he had been building monuments to his own vanity in New York, she had been raising his soul in the shadows of the South. Elena spotted him then. Her laughter died. Her expression didn't shift into fear or anger. It settled into a terrifying, royal indifference. She gathered the 3 children close to her skirts, her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of the smallest boy. Alistair began to move toward them, his hand outstretched, his voice a broken rasp. "Elena, please, the children, they're—" Elena didn't wait for him to reach them. She turned her back on the billionaire, leading the triplets toward a modest USV. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to join our beautiful community of stories. We are so curious to know, where in the world are you joining us today from? Please drop a comment with your city or country below. We love seeing how far our love reaches. Now, let's continue. As Elena pulled out of the parking lot, a black sedan with tinted windows followed her, but it wasn't Alistair's. A woman in the passenger seat of the second car lowered her sunglasses, revealing the cold, calculating eyes of Vivian Ashford. She watched the triplets with a predatory smile and picked up her phone. "He saw them," Vivian whispered into the line. "It's time to activate the contingency. If Alistair wants his heirs, he's going to have to pay the price we agreed on 4 years ago." Alistair stood in the middle of the park, watching the 2 cars disappear, and realized with a jolt of terror, if Vivian was in Charleston, then who has really been running my empire from the shadows for the last 3 years?
Charleston is a city built on the echoes of the past, where the scent of salt air mingles with the heavy, humid perfume of jasmine and rot. For Elena Rossi, the move from the sterile glass of Manhattan to the weathered limestone of the South was not a relocation, it was a burial. She had come here to let the woman Alistair Vane called Nothing die in the marshlands, making room for the mother who would have to become everything. She settled into her Aunt Rosalind's cottage on the edge of the Cooper River, a place where the floorboards groaned under the weight of secrets and the porch was perpetually dusted with the fine white silt of the Atlantic. She had arrived with 1 suitcase and a heart that felt like it had been scraped hollow with a rusted spoon. She hadn't taken the check. She hadn't taken the alimony. She had taken only the 3 heartbeats that were currently the only things preventing her from dissolving into the humidity. The first 6 months were a siege of biology. A triplet pregnancy is a high-stakes gamble, a physical tax that strips the color from the skin and the marrow from the bone. Elena spent her days on a worn recliner, watching the tide go in and out, a rhythmic penance for a love she had been too foolish to question. She lived on ginger tea, dry crackers, and the stubborn refusal to miscarry the only miracles Alistair had ever given her. "You're fading, child," Aunt Rosalind would whisper, pressing a cool cloth to Elena's forehead. "You can't carry the weight of his hate and the weight of these 3 souls at the same time. One of them has to go." "I've already buried him, Aunt Ro," Elena had replied, her voice a thin, lethal thread. "The man I loved is a ghost. I'm only breathing for the living now." The triplets arrived in a violent rush on a Tuesday in July during a thunderstorm that turned the Charleston streets into rivers. The labor was a hurricane of pain, 16 hours of Elena gripping the hospital bed rails until her knuckles were as white as the linens. There was no billionaire husband pacing the floor of a private wing. There was no security detail or celebratory champagne. There was only the clinical beep of a public ward monitor and the fierce protective fury of a woman who had already been discarded. Lorelei was born first, a tiny 4-pound warrior with Alistair's restless intensity. Then Emily, with eyes that already seemed to be mapping the room for an exit. Finally, Caspian, the smallest, whose heart stuttered with a weak, irregular rhythm that nearly faltered before he could take his first gulp of air. Holding them in the dim light of the recovery room, Elena felt a wealth that Alistair Vane, in all his gilded arrogance, would never comprehend. She realized then that nature had given the legacy to the woman he called a liability.
The years that followed were a forge. Elena Rossi lived in a world of coffee, design software, and the constant demanding weight of 3 toddlers. She returned to her roots in architecture, using the last of her grandmother's small inheritance to buy a refurbished laptop and a subscription to a drafting program. She specialized in the architecture of survival, structures built to withstand the very storms that had nearly destroyed her. She built her firm, Moretti and Ayers, in the midnight hours. She worked until her eyes burned, and then she went home to the 3 miracles that were the only gold she would ever own. By the time the triplets were 3 years old, she was no longer the medicine school dropout or the cheater of Alistair's narrative. She was the most sought-after eco-architect in the Carolinas, a woman who built fortresses of truth while the Shadow King was still living in a prison of lies. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, the Vane Empire was thriving in the market, but rotting in the soul. Alistair Vane had spent 3 years in a state of high-functioning numbness. He had kept the Manhattan penthouse exactly as it was the night Elena left, a perverse monument to his own correctness. He told himself he was a man of data, and the data provided by Vivian Ashford dictated that Elena was a cheater. But the collapse of the lie began with a whistleblower. 6 months ago, a technician from the private security firm Alistair used had sent him a series of raw, unedited metadata files. He saw the photos of Elena and Marcus again, but this time he saw the full frame. He saw Marcus's pregnant wife standing just out of the previous crop. He saw the secret messages being sent not from Elena's phone, but mirrored through a device registered to Vivian Ashford. Alistair had sat in his office for 6 hours, the blue light of the screen reflecting in eyes that were suddenly overflowing with a 3-year grief. He had realized then that he hadn't been protecting a legacy, he had been a puppet for a narcissist. He had cast the love of his life into a storm because he was too broken to trust the one person who had ever truly seen him. He had fired Vivian that night, stripping her of her shares and her reputation, but the damage was done. Elena was a ghost he couldn't find, a signature on a divorce decree that was now a death warrant for his peace. He had spent millions with investigators, but Elena had been too smart. She erased her digital footprint and used the name Rossi, a maiden name his team had missed in their arrogance. Then the Charleston merger happened. He hadn't come for the logistics. He had come because he had heard whispers of a firm called Moretti and Ayers that used a logo, 3 interlaced circles, that matched a drawing Elena had made on a napkin during their honeymoon. He had found her in White Point Garden.
The moment their eyes met, Alistair realized that his trillion-dollar tower was just a vertical coffin. Elena looked powerful. She looked whole. She looked like a woman who had mastered the very steel and glass he had used to imprison himself. But seeing the children, the 3 identical mirrors of his own sapphire blue eyes, had been the final incision. He stood now in the parking lot, the humid air of Charleston feeling like lead in his lungs. He watched Elena's SUV pull away, his heart thumping with a rhythm that was 4 years overdue. "I have to follow her," Alistair whispered to the empty air. "I have to find a way to pay a debt that gold can't touch." But as he reached for his car door, a hand gripped his shoulder. It wasn't a friend. It was an officer of the Charleston Police Department. "Mr. Vane, we've received a report of a suspicious individual matching your description, following a local woman and her children in the park. I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Alistair looked past the officer, his eyes scanning the road. He saw a second car, a black sedan he didn't recognize, following Elena's SUV at a dangerous proximity. And in the passenger seat, catching a glint of the street lamp, were the unmistakable, cold eyes of Vivian Ashford. Alistair didn't fight the officer. He didn't call his lawyers. He looked at the police dashcam and realized with a jolt of terror that the trap hadn't been for Elena 4 years ago. It was for the children today. He turned to the officer, his face ashen. "Officer, I'll go with you, but you need to call in a pursuit for that black sedan. My children are in the car in front of it, and the woman driving that sedan didn't come to Charleston for a merger." The officer frowned, checking his radio. "We don't have any record of a black sedan, sir, but we do have a warrant for your arrest. It seems your former partner, Vivian Ashford, filed a report 2 hours ago claiming you've been using corporate funds to track an ex-wife you were legally barred from contacting." Alistair felt the handcuffs click around his wrists, the steel cold as the San Francisco rain. He looked at the fading taillights of Elena's car and felt a scream die in his throat. As Alistair was led into the back of the patrol car, his phone, still in the officer's hand, buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. The screen illuminated a single photo, the interior of Elena's cottage with Aunt Rosalind lying unconscious on the floor and the triplets' backpacks lined up by the door, empty. Alistair watched the officer pocket his phone and thought, if Vivian is the one who called the police to stop me, then who is currently inside that house waiting for Elena and my children to come home?
The interior of the police cruiser smelled of stale coffee, cold vinyl, and the suffocating realization of a king who had traded his throne for a cage. Alistair Vane sat in the back, his hands cuffed behind his back, feeling the bite of the steel against his skin, a physical echo of the emotional shackles he had worn for 48 months. Outside, the moss-draped oaks of Charleston blurred into a green and gray kaleidoscope as the car accelerated toward the precinct. The officer, a man named Miller, was occupied with the radio, his eyes fixed on the road, oblivious to the fact that the man in his back seat was currently watching his entire world ignite in the rearview mirror. "Officer, look at the phone," Alistair said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the static of the radio. "The photo that just arrived. That house is 412 Marsh Lane. If you don't turn this car around, you're not just arresting a billionaire, you're participating in a kidnapping." Miller didn't look back. "Nice try, Vane. Most guys your size try to bribe me. You're the first one to invent a thriller plot on the way to booking. Sit back. Let your lawyers do the talking when we get to the station." "I don't have time for lawyers," Alistair roared, the billionaire armor finally shattering to reveal the desperate father beneath. He slammed his head against the plexiglass partition. "That woman, Vivian Ashford, she is the reason I'm in these cuffs. She's the one who called you, and she's currently at that address where my children, your citizens, are about to pay for my mistakes. Check the GPS. Check the registration of that black sedan." At that exact moment, 2 miles away, Elena Rossi pulled her SUV into the gravel driveway of the cottage. The Cooper River was a dark, obsidian mirror under the rising moon, the cicadas creating a wall of sound that usually signaled peace. But as the headlights swept across the porch, Elena felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. The front door was ajar. In Charleston, doors stayed open for neighbors, but they were always locked against the dark. Elena's hand tightened on the steering wheel. Her surgical mind, trained to assess trauma in seconds, began to map the anomalies. The porch light was smashed. The scent of lavender, Aunt Rose's signature, was being choked out by the heavy artificial scent of Claire de Lune, the industrial perfume Vivian Ashford had worn like a weapon for years. "Mama, why is the door open?" Lorelei asked from the back seat, her voice tight with the intuition she had inherited from a mother who had survived a billionaire's betrayal. "Stay in the car," Elena commanded, her voice dropping into a resonant, lethal calm. "Lock the doors. Do not open them for anyone but me or Aunt Ro. Do you understand, Caleb, Caspian?" The boys nodded, their sapphire eyes wide with terror they couldn't name but could clearly feel. Elena stepped out of the SUV, her heels crunching on the shells of the driveway. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy brass architect's scale, not a weapon, but the closest thing she had to a blade. She walked up the steps, her pulse a flat, disciplined rhythm. She was no longer the woman who had begged Alistair Vane for his trust. She was the architect of survival. The interior of the cottage was a wreckage of memory. The hand-painted tea sets were shattered, the drafting table where she had built her firm was overturned, and in the center of the room, lying near the hearth, was Rosalind. "Ro!" Elena gasped, dropping to her knees. She checked the pulse, thready but present, a blow to the head. "She's a sturdy woman, your aunt. It took 2 hits to keep her down. A pity. I always admired the working class's resilience." Vivian Ashford stepped into the light. She looked exactly as she had 3 years ago, perfectly tailored, her blonde hair a helmet of gold, her eyes 2 chips of frozen emerald. She was holding a small, high-tech device that Aria recognized as a Thorn-Tech signal jammer. "Vivian," Elena whispered, standing up slowly, her face a razor of New York steel. "You followed me here. After 3 years of silence, you came to my home." "Your home?" Vivian laughed, a sharp metallic sound. "This is a hut in a swamp, and you're just a squatter, using a dead man's DNA to fund a boutique firm. I didn't come for you, Elena. I came for the shares. The triplets represent 40% of Vane Global's voting rights through the Legacy Trust. Silas was too sentimental to dissolve it, and my father needs that block to finalize the merger." Vivian stepped closer, the signal jammer glowing red in her hand. "The police have Silas now. He'll be tied up in processing for 6 hours, more than enough time for me to take the children to the private airstrip. By the time he's out, they'll be Thorn heirs in name, but Ashford property in practice. You can have the cottage, Elena. Consider it your severance." Outside, a muffled scream erupted from the SUV. Elena's heart didn't just stutter, it stopped. "The car is magnetically sealed," Elena said, her voice a razor of New York steel. "You can't get in." "I don't need to get in," Vivian smiled, holding up a remote. "I built the security systems for Thorn-Tech, remember? I have the master override. I can unlock that SUV from here, or I can cycle the climate control until the air inside becomes unbreathable. Choice is yours, Dr. Rossi." Back in the police car, Alistair was watching Miller's face. The officer had finally checked his mobile terminal. His expression shifted from skepticism to a deep, radiating alarm. "Dispatch, this is Unit 42. Run a cross-check on the Ashford warrant and get me a visual on a black Mercedes sedan, tag Victor Alpha 9. I have a 1016 in progress at 412 Marsh Lane." The radio crackled back. "Unit 42, be advised, the Ashford warrant was flagged as a priority bypass. We have a report of a home invasion at that address. All units move to Marsh Lane." Miller looked in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Alistair's. "You're still a cheater in my book, Vane, but I don't let kids get taken on my watch." He slammed the car into a U-turn, the tires screaming as they banked toward the river. Alistair leaned his head against the glass, his eyes closed. He was a billionaire who had spent his life controlling the movement of goods across the globe, yet he was currently a passenger in his own reckoning.
The police cruiser tore through the gates of the Marsh Lane property just as the doors of Elena's SUV hissed open. Vivian's men were reaching for the children. Alistair didn't wait for Miller to open the door. He threw his weight against the handle, falling out of the car as it was still sliding to a halt. He hit the gravel hard, the pain in his shoulder a distant noise compared to the sight of his daughter, Lorelei, being lifted from her seat. "Get your hands off her!" Alistair roared, struggling to his feet, his hands still bound behind him. He moved like a wounded titan, charging the first guard with the pure kinetic force of his own body. He struck the man with a shoulder, sending him sprawling into the azaleas. Inside the cottage, Elena heard the commotion. She looked at Vivian, and the Ice Queen of Manhattan finally let the fire out. She didn't use the architect's scale. She used the weight of her own history. She lunged at Vivian, tackling her into the shattered tea sets, her fingers reaching for the remote.
"You called me nothing, Beatrice," Elena screamed, her voice a hurricane of 4 years of suppressed rage. "You said I was trash, but trash is what you do with things you're finished with. I am the one who built their hearts. I am the one who kept them breathing." The struggle was a blur of emerald silk and industrial perfume. The remote skittered across the floor, sliding under the overturned drafting table. Outside, the scene was a theater of shadows. Alistair was on the ground again. Miller was shouting into his radio, and the children were huddling near the car, their blue eyes wide with the realization that the sad man from the park was currently bleeding in the dirt to keep them safe. Alistair looked up, his vision blurred by the blood from his forehead. He saw Elena emerge from the cottage, her dress torn, her face a mask of primal maternal triumph. She was holding the signal jammer, and behind her, Vivian was being led out by 2 more officers who had just arrived. Elena stopped in the center of the driveway. She looked at the police cars, the handcuffs, and then at Alistair. The silence that followed was the heaviest Alistair had ever carried. The triplets ran to Elena, burying their faces in her emerald skirts. Caspian, the smallest, looked at Alistair, then at his mother. "Mama, the sad man, he's the one who fought the shadows." Elena looked at Alistair, really looked at him, for the first time without the shield of her success. She saw the billionaire who had been reduced to a beggar in the dirt. She saw the man who had lost his empire, but found his soul. But as the officers moved to unlock Alistair's cuffs, a final car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a police car. It was a white ambulance, its lights silent, but its presence heavy with a new clinical dread. A medic stepped out, looking at the charts on his tablet. "We have a report for a Noah Vance. The clinic in New York flagged his heart monitor 5 minutes ago. The valve repair Dr. Rossi performed is showing signs of a secondary rejection. We need to transport him to the surgical suite immediately." Alistair felt the ground dissolve beneath his feet for the second time that night. He looked at Noah, the boy whose name was tattooed over his own failing heart, and realized that the battle for the Thorne legacy had just been replaced by the battle for a single heartbeat. As the medics lifted Noah into the ambulance, Lady Beatrice Thorne's voice crackled through a speaker on Vivian's abandoned phone, which lay in the gravel. "The rejection isn't natural, Elena," the voice hissed, cold and triumphant even from a distance. "I knew you were a genius surgeon, so I ensured that the valve you used for Noah's repair was modified at the Thorne warehouse before it ever reached New York. If you want the antidote for the synthetic calcification I installed, you'll have to sign the children over to me before his heart stops." Alistair looked at the ambulance and then at his mother's voice in the dirt and thought, "If I built the logistics firm that moved that valve, then am I the one who physically provided the weapon that is currently killing my own son? Can a father's redemption begin if his greatest achievement, his global logistics empire, is revealed to be the very machine that delivered a death sentence to his child?"
If this story is touching your soul, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these powerful tales of redemption and truth with the world. Now, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Let's continue with the reckoning. The hum of the ambulance was a jagged electronic prayer that cut through the humid Charleston night. Inside the narrow, vibrating cabin, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the sterile, metallic tang of emergency medicine. Dr. Elena Rossi, the woman Manhattan's surgical elite called the Ice Queen, was gone. In her place was a mother whose world had narrowed to the jagged green line on a portable monitor. She knelt on the floor of the moving vehicle, her fingers pressed against the carotid artery of her son, Noah. His skin was the color of parched parchment, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle that mocked every skyscraper she had ever built, every accolade she had ever won. "Pressure is 50/30 and dropping," the paramedic shouted over the siren. "He's going into cardiogenic shock." Elena didn't look up. She was staring at the small synthetic valve fluttering inside her son's chest, a piece of high-grade medical technology she had personally selected 4 years ago. She had trusted the Thorne Logistics Network. She had trusted the security of the Sterling name. And now
Hearing the ghost of Beatrice Thorne's voice in her head, she realized she had unknowingly sown a ticking time bomb into her own child's heart. "Start the dopamine drip," Elena commanded. Her voice was a low, lethal whisper that silenced the panic in the cabin. "And call MUSC. Tell them Dr. Elena Vance is coming in. I need a bypass circuit prepped and a pediatric cardiothoracic team standing by. I'm not losing him to a shadow." In the SUV behind the ambulance, Alistair Vane sat in a state of catatonic clarity. The handcuffs were gone, replaced by the heavy, invisible chains of a guilt that was finally, truly alive. He watched the ambulance's red and blue lights paint the moss-draped oaks in a series of bloody flashes. He pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys with the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun a landslide. He was the king of logistics. He could track a single crate of microchips across 3 oceans in real time. He bypassed his own company's encryption, tearing through the firewalls of Vane Global until he found the manifest for the October 2021 medical shipments. The data scrolled past in a blur of gray and white. Item: biosynthetic mitral valve. Destination: Mount Sinai, NYC. Proxy: Thorne Vance Medical Trust. Alistair clicked on the shipment's history. There it was, a 12-hour maintenance delay at a private warehouse in Savannah, a facility owned by a subsidiary of his mother's estate. The log was signed by a technician who didn't exist. Alistair closed the laptop with a sound like a gunshot. His mother hadn't just lied about Serafina's infidelity. She had used his own empire, the logistics machine he had built to define his greatness, to deliver the instrument of his own son's death. He had physically provided the weapon. He had signed the shipping orders. He had been the architect of his own son's murder. "Stop the car," Alistair rumbled to the officer driving the SUV. "Sir, we're almost at the hospital." "Stop the car now," Alistair roared, his voice shattering the remaining Billionaire poise. He didn't wait for the vehicle to halt. He rolled out of the SUV as it slowed, hit the pavement of the hospital driveway, and sprinted toward the emergency bay. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the board members who would see the video of the Vane CEO covered in gravel and sweat. He reached the doors just as Noah was being wheeled into the trauma suite. Elena was beside the gurney, her face a mask of absolute professional ice, but her eyes were 2 burning pits of maternal fire. "Elena!" Alistair gasped, grabbing the doorframe to steady his heaving chest. "I found it. The manifest. It was modified in Savannah. The valve, it's not calcifying naturally. It's a synthetic coating designed to respond to a specific radio frequency. She wasn't just watching him, Elena. She was triggering it." Elena stopped. She looked at Alistair, and for the first time in 4 years, the cheater narrative was completely, irrevocably dead. She saw the man who had been the logistics god, now reduced to a beggar in a ruin. "If it's frequency-based, there's an override," Elena said, her mind already calculating the surgical implications. "I need the encryption key for the Thorne Sentinel software. Now, Alistair, if I open him without disabling the coding, the tissue will tear like wet paper." "I don't have the key," Alistair whispered, his face draining of color. "My mother has it. She's at the private airfield. She has a jet waiting." Elena stepped into his space, her surgical mask hanging around her neck like a discarded shroud. "Then be the man you claim to be, Alistair. You built the machine. Find the key or stay out of the way while I try to do the impossible with a scalpel." She turned and vanished into the scrub room. Alistair stood alone in the hallway, the hospital's intercom system paging doctors he didn't know, for emergencies he couldn't fix. He looked at his hands, the hands that once signed away a family for a seat at the Sterling table. He realized then that his billions were just a heap of cold metal. He pulled out his phone and dialed the one number he had vowed never to call again.
"Mother," he said when the line connected. His voice was a calm, resonant melody that chilled the very air of the hospital hallway. "I am standing in the lobby of MUSC. My son is on the table, and I am currently holding the decryption keys to your offshore accounts, the ones the SEC doesn't know about yet." "Silas, don't be dramatic," Beatrice Thorne's voice hissed through the speaker, sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. "I am securing the future of this family. Those children are Thorne property. They deserve a better upbringing than a surgeon's apartment in Brooklyn." "They are not Thorne property," Alistair said, his eyes fixed on the red, occupied light of the OR. "They are my soul. And if you don't send the frequency override to Dr. Rossi's tablet in the next 60 seconds, I will broadcast your entire financial history to every federal agency in the country. I will burn the Thorne name to the ground, Mother. I will make us the poorest family in history before I let my son's heart stop." The silence on the line stretched for 10 seconds, 10 seconds that felt like the cooling of a sun. "You were always too sentimental, Alistair," Beatrice whispered, "just like your father. He died for a girl, too." The line went dead. Alistair's phone chimed. A data packet had been sent to the hospital's secure server. He didn't celebrate. He walked to the viewing gallery of Operating Room 4. He sat in the dark, looking down at the stage where Elena was working. She was hunched over the tiny body of their son, her hands moving with a speed that bypassed human limits. The monitors were a symphony of alarms, a chaotic, high-pitched war for a single life. He watched as Elena received the notification on her heads-up display. He saw her pause, a single deep breath expanding her chest, and then she dove back in. Hours passed in a clinical blur. Alistair didn't move. He became a part of the architecture of the hospital, a monument to regret. He watched the sun rise over the Atlantic, the golden light bleeding through the high windows of the gallery, painting the surgical team in shades of amber. Finally, the lights in the OR dimmed. Elena stepped back from the table. She looked up at the gallery, her eyes finding Alistair's in the darkness. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once. Noah was alive. Alistair collapsed into the chair, his forehead resting on the cool glass of the gallery window. He wept, not the tears of a CEO, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a man who had seen the afterlife and been sent back to pay a debt. An hour later, Elena found him in the recovery lounge. She looked exhausted, her scrubs stained with the blood of their son. She sat on the opposite end of the sofa, the distance between them still a chasm of 4 years and a million lies. "He's stable," Elena said. "The valve is repaired. The calcification is gone. He'll need a long recovery, but he's Noah again." "Thank you," Alistair managed to say, his voice a broken rasp. "I didn't do it for you, Alistair," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "I did it because I'm a surgeon, and because he is mine." "I know," Alistair said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a legal folder. "And that's why I'm doing this." He slid the folder across the table. Elena opened it. Inside were papers for a total abdication of his role at Vane Global. He was surrendering his shares, his voting rights, and his assets to a trust for the triplets, managed entirely by Elena. "I'm leaving, Elena," Alistair whispered. "I'm moving to a house in the Low Country. It's small, it's quiet, it has no glass walls. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure the Thorne name is never associated with anything but the Vance Foundation." "You're walking away from the Empire?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "The Empire was a vertical coffin, Fina," Alistair said, standing up. "I'm finally learning how to live in the dirt. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I only ask that someday, when Noah is strong enough to walk, you let me sit on a bench and watch him from a distance, just to know that his heart is still beating." He turned to walk away, but a sudden commotion at the nurses' station made them both freeze. Special Agent Miller was there, surrounded by a team of federal marshals. He looked at Alistair with a grim, clinical focus. "Mr. Wayne, we've intercepted your mother at the airfield. She's in custody, but she gave us a statement that you might find interesting."
Miller held up a digital recording device. She says she wasn't the only one who wanted the triplets removed from the equation 4 years ago. She says there was a second investor, someone who has been funding Dr. Rossi's firm from the beginning to ensure she stayed hidden from you. Alistair looked at Elena and then at the agent. He felt a new, colder shadow fall over the room. "Who?" he asked, his voice a lethal whisper. Miller pressed play. The voice that filled the recovery lounge was deep, anchoring, and unmistakably familiar. The voice of the one person Elena had trusted with her life in New York. "I don't care what it costs. Keep Aria in the dark. If Silas Thorne finds those triplets, he'll become the man he was always meant to be, and I can't have a king returning to my city." Elena's heart stopped as she recognized the voice of her brother, Caleb.
Arya looked at the door and realized with a jolt of terror, if my brother is the one who has been keeping us apart, then who is currently standing in Noah's recovery room with a syringe in his hand? Forgiveness is not a destination. It is a grueling march through the ruins of who we were, toward the fragile light of who we might become. The air in Noah's recovery suite was pressurized, thick with the scent of sterile plastic and the electric hum of a mother's terror. Dr. Arya Rossi, the whisk who could blend the most volatile elements of a human life into a masterpiece, stood in the doorway, her world narrowing to the figure standing beside her son. Her brother, Caleb, the man who had been her anchor in the storm of New York, the man who had held her hand when the triplets were born. He was holding a syringe, the needle hovering just inches from Noah's IV port. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a weary architect whose most beautiful structure was finally beginning to lean. "Step away from the bed, Caleb," Arya said. Her voice was a low, lethal whisper that cut through the blaring of the hospital's intercom. Caleb didn't flinch. He looked down at Noah, the boy with the fragile heart and the billionaire's eyes, and then at his sister. "I'm not going to hurt him, Fina. I'm giving him the sedative the nurse forgot. His rhythm is too high. He's dreaming of things he can't handle." "I said, step back," Arya repeated, her hand moving to the silent alarm on her hip. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling glass of the suite reflected a new shadow. Alistair Vane, born Silas Thorne, stepped into the room. He was a man stripped of his bespoke armor, his shirt stained with gravel, and his heart held together by a synthetic valve and a newfound humility. He looked at Caleb, and for the first time in 4 years, the two titans of their respective worlds stood in the same air. "The recording was clear, Caleb," Alistair said, his sapphire eyes burning with a cold, analytical clarity. "You weren't just funding the firm to keep Arya hidden. You were managing the Whisk and Blade expansion because it was the only way you could stay relevant in a city that only respects the Thorne name. You needed me to stay a ghost so you could play king." Caleb laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the gray-tiled walls. He set the syringe on the rolling tray and turned to face them, his hands tucked into the pockets of his sensible wool coat. "Relevant? I saved her, Silas. While you were busy signing a divorce decree in a San Francisco office, I was finding a brownstone in Brooklyn. I built the infrastructure for her survival. I was the one who made sure the Volkov group never found her. I did the work you were too arrogant to even imagine." "You did the work to own her," Arya cried, the professional mask finally shattering. "You let me believe he hated my children. You let me live in a fortress of lies because you liked the power of being my only truth." "I liked the safety of it," Caleb countered, his gaze hardening. "If Silas Thorne returns to the world, the wolves come with him. Look at what happened tonight. A home invasion, a biological attack on a 4-year-old's heart. I was the one keeping the darkness out, Arya. He is the darkness." Alistair stepped forward, stopping just inches from Caleb. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't call for his security team. He looked at his brother-in-law with the weary wisdom of a man who had seen the bottom of his own soul and found it wanting.
"The darkness isn't me, Caleb," Alistair said, his voice a calm, resonant melody. "The darkness is the belief that we have the right to curate other people's lives. You thought you were protecting her, but you were just building a smaller cage. I'm the one who provided the weapon that almost killed my son tonight, and you're the one who provided the silence that allowed it to happen. We are both monsters in this story. The only difference is that I'm ready to stop pretending I'm a hero." The standoff lasted for a heartbeat that felt like a century. Finally, Caleb's shoulders slumped. The fire of his self-righteousness flickered and died, leaving only the ashen reality of a man who had betrayed the person he loved most. He walked towards the door, stopping only when he reached Arya's side. "The keys to the trust are in the safe at the office," Caleb whispered, not meeting his eyes. "I never spent a cent of his money on myself, Fina. I just wanted to be the man who kept you whole." "You were the man who kept me broken, Caleb," Arya replied, her voice a razor. "Go, and if you ever come near my children again, I won't use a recording to stop you. I'll use a scalpel." Caleb vanished into the hospital hallway, a shadow returning to the night. Arya collapsed into the chair beside Noah's bed, her forehead resting on the cool metal rail. She wept, the deep, wrenching sobs of a woman who had realized that her sanctuary was a prison and her anchor was a chain. Alistair stood at the window watching the sun rise over the Cooper River, the golden light bleeding through the humidity and painting the room in shades of a difficult, honest amber. 6 months later, the Thorn Empire was a ghost story whispered in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. The Thorn Group had been completely liquidated, its assets absorbed by the Vance Foundation for Neonatal Care. Lady Beatrice was awaiting sentencing in a federal facility, her legacy reduced to a series of criminal case files and a reputation that had been burned to a cinder.
In a quiet corner of the South Carolina Low Country, on the edge of a marsh where the egrets were the only witnesses to the tides, the air didn't smell of expensive lilies or industrial disinfectant. It smelled of pluff mud, salt air, and the slow, patient scent of growth. Arya Rossi stood on the porch of a modest 3-bedroom farmhouse. She was dressed in a worn linen shirt and jeans, her hair wind-blown and free of the Ice Queen bob. She was no longer a surgeon for the elite. She ran a community clinic on the island, serving families who had never seen the inside of a penthouse. "Mama, look, the bridge is finished." Caleb and Mia ran across the grass, their identical sapphire eyes wide with triumph. They were holding a structure made of driftwood and twine, a masterpiece of structural integrity and childish imagination. Behind them, Noah walked slowly, his gait steady, and his heart, the heart his father had unintentionally tried to break, beating with a quiet, persistent strength. "It's beautiful, little ones," Arya said, kneeling to inspect the bridge. "But does it have a foundation?" "Daddy said a foundation is just a promise you keep to the ground," Mia said, pointing toward the edge of the marsh. Arya looked up. A man was walking toward them through the tall grass. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a charcoal suit. He was wearing work boots and a faded flannel shirt, his hands calloused from the garden he had been tending since dawn. Alistair Vane, no longer a billionaire, no longer the king of logistics, worked as the logistics manager for the local food bank and the primary architect for the island's community center. He earned $48,000 a year and drove a used truck that smelled of mulch and dog hair. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his eyes locking onto Arya's. The silence between them was no longer a fortress, it was a conversation. It was a bridge built of 6 months of difficult therapy, a million apologies that were never enough, and the slow, agonizing work of learning how to trust the air again. "The delivery for the clinic is at the dock," Alistair said, his voice a low, steady rumble that anchored the afternoon. "And the kids have a question for you." Arya stood up, her hand brushing the hair from Mia's face. "Is it about the bridge?" "No," Caleb said, taking Alistair's hand. "We want to know if the sad man can stay for dinner.
He said he has a recipe for Rossi sauce that he's been practicing. Arya looked at Alistair, really looked at him. She saw the man who had abdicated a throne to sit on a park bench. She saw the father who had faced a federal marshals to save a son he had never held. And she saw the husband who had once been a monster, but was now just a man trying to find his way home. "Is the sauce ready, Alistair?" Arya asked, her voice softening for the first time in 4 years. "The sauce has been simmering for 48 months, Arya," he replied, his eyes filling with a clarity that gold could never buy. "It's finally ready to be served." Arya stepped aside, opening the door to the small farmhouse. "Then come in, Silas. You're just in time for the beginning." As the family walked inside, their laughter filling the quiet low-country air, the Shadow King finally stepped into the light. He had lost his towers, he had lost his billions, and he had lost his name. But as he sat at a wooden table with the woman he had destroyed and the miracles he had abandoned, Alistair Vane finally understood the true logistics of a soul. The debt was not paid. It would never be fully paid. But the heartbeat was steady. And in the silence of the marsh, a new story began. One that wasn't written in the ink of a divorce decree, but in the slow, patient work of a family choosing to build something that wouldn't break. The empire fell, but the heart was repaired. Alistair Vane discovered true power isn't found in the height of a tower, but in the depth of a child's trust. As the sun sets over the marsh, one final shadow lingers in the corner of the garden. If Lady Beatrice is in prison and Caleb is in exile, then who sent the bouquet of jasmine and a single silver-knitted booty to Arya's porch this morning? And why did the note inside say, "The Thorn Group never forgets its own"? My beautiful family, this story is a reminder that while the past is carved in bone, the future is always ours to shape. True success is not measured by the numbers in our bank accounts, but by the love we are brave enough to hold on to when everything else falls away. Thank you for being the soul of this channel. Your kindness and your loyalty are the only legacy that truly matters to me. If this journey touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a single heartbeat of our stories. We are a family of second chances, and your support helps us share this message of hope with the world. And now, I am so curious, where in the world are you joining us today? Please drop a comment with your city or country below. I read every single one, and it fills my heart with joy to see how far our love reaches. Until next time, hand in hand, heart to heart, one family, one love, forever.